Everyone, welcome. Trevor Williams with Global Atlanta, and you are now joining us with the today's webinar on K-pop, how Korea's musical export stole the heart of the global audience. So that's an ambitious title. We're going to have a sweeping conversation on this topic of global interest. I'm, like I said, with Global Atlanta. We're an international business news service here in Atlanta, covering the way that the global economy impacts our hometown here. And we partner extensively with the diplomatic corps on many issues, mostly regarding international business and trade and how their countries are investing here and things of that nature, but are excited today to get outside of our normal box a little bit and focus a little bit on culture and how this international cultural phenomenon is sweeping the globe. So again, we've partnered here with the Consulate General of Korea in Atlanta to present this event and to provide us a few opening remarks before we get started. I'm going to ask the Consul General of Korea, Young-jun Kim, to welcome us. Consul General Kim.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Williams, for your kind introduction. Professor Kim and Professor Medina, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at today's webinar on K-pop and its cultural influence in the United States. As you know very well, the Korea-US alliance, forged in blood during the Korean War 70 years ago, has developed into one of the most robust and successful alliances. But until a few years ago, most Americans did not know much about Korean culture and lifestyles. To some of them, Korea was still remembered like a tarnished black and white photo showing their father or grandfathers fighting for freedom and democracies of a country they did not know. Now, things are changing dramatically thanks to the size mega hit song Gangnam Style. Gangnam District sold the wealthiest and fanciest areas, drew attentions of the people all around the world, and became the most popular travel destination for foreign visitors. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, the year 2020 has been really special for the lovers of Korean culture, in which South Korea achieved two major cultural breakthroughs. First, Korean director Bong Joon-ho's film Parasite became the first non-English speaking film to win Best Picture at the Academy Award. Then BTS, the 7-member Korean boy band, made history when its single Dynamite sold on to #1 at the Billboard Hot 100 song chart. It was the first Korean artist top-selling song at the Billboard chart. Last week, BTS Life Goes On not only became the band's third #1 hit, and also the first #1 song in the Billboard chart's history, which is sung in Korean language. This historic achievement by the Korean artists in the United States confirmed the continuous growth of the so-called Hallyu Korean wave. The scope of the Korean wave already have been expanded from cultural products such as K-pop, K-drama, K-movie, to broader cultural export like K-cuisine, K-beauty, and K-art. The success of Korean wave also boosted South Korea's cultural diplomacy significantly by winning the heart and mind of people across the world and enhancing the national images of South Korea. Today's webinar has not been made possible without close cooperation between Korean Consulate and Global Atlanta. I'd like to thank again Mr. Williams and his team for their excellent preparations. My special thanks goes to our guests, Professor Sukyung Kim and Professor Wang Medina, and Ms. Dhaylin Lee, who will share their knowledge, experiences on this fascinating and dynamic topic this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Consul General Kim. And just a quick note on the logistics of the event here. We are asking, we've opted for the meeting format here. So we're asking people, except for our speakers, to keep your videos and audio muted so that we can make sure that we preserve the bandwidth for the featured speakers. But we do like the fact that you can see who else is in the room, potentially chat with other people, and also interact as if we were together in person. Of course, one of the great things about our world today is that we can continue to interact even amid the pandemic using technology. But of course, some of the things that we're used to, the aspects of in-person events that we're used to are harder to come by. So we like, again, having people in the room, but we just have to make sure we make space for our speakers to be actually featured. So I am so happy that we're addressing this topic. I have to admit, I'm the biggest novice when it comes to K-pop. I'm not very well versed in the topic. I took my only trip to Korea in 2009. And then when Gangnam Style was released in 2012, I was just happy I knew where Gangnam was and I'd been there, but I totally didn't get the phenomenon of the song that became the first YouTube video that was able to garner 1 billion views. Now, you've got the likes like Consul General Kim of BTS and Blackpink, who are the mega groups. There are lots of other extremely popular groups that I'm not well versed with. And then I just noticed that even I have 2 children here at home, and you might hear them in the background, but I noticed the Baby Shark video that is garnered 7.4 views on YouTube, the most viewed video of all time, actually of a Korean company as well, from what I understand. So these are astronomical figures that show like Consul General Kim said, the growing wave of Korean culture that's going sweeping the world, and of course with financial and economic repercussions. I just saw that the entertainment group behind BTS raised $820 million in an IPO, valuing the company Big Hit Entertainment at more than $4 billion. And so there's, with any wave, there are going to be ripples that go beyond just the actual cultural elements, and that's the thing that I'm so excited to talk about here today. And to give our audience a bit of an introduction to our speakers, we have Dr. Suk-Young Kim, who is a professor at the School of Theater, Film, and Television at UCLA. Dr. Kim's research covers a wide range of disciplines such as East Asian performance, visual culture, gender and nationalism, Korean cultural studies, Russian literature, and Slavic folklore. I'm not sure how she has time to sleep and do all these things at the same time, but she's an author of multiple books, including a few addressing performance in North Korea and things like that. But her most recent book, published in 2018, is K-Pop Live: Fans, Idols, and Multimedia Performance. Thank you so much, Dr. Kim, for being with us. If you want to say a few words to get going in the conversation, then I'll go ahead with other introductions.
Well, thank you for the general introduction. I'm really glad to be here. Atlanta has a special place in my heart. Perhaps sometime we can chat in private about that, but because
Sure.
it's co-hosted by Global Atlanta and also Consulate General of Korea, I would like to extend my special thanks to our generous host, Consul General Kim, as well as you and all the other staff who made this event possible. Really happy to be here today.
Thank you so much. We're looking forward to the discussion. And also joining us today, we have closer to home, Dr. Wang Medina, who's an assistant professor in the Russian and East Asian Languages and Cultures department at Emory University. Jenny is a translator. She completed her PhD in East Asian Languages and Cultures at Columbia University in 2015. And then before joining the faculty at Emory in 2019, she held positions at Rutgers and at Columbia. Her primary scholarly focus is modern Korean literature and culture. And she's been published quite frequently and widely. Jenny, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we're excited to hear from you. So the format we've landed on, I think we're going to start with Dr. Kim, but Dr. Wang Medina, if you would like to interject throughout this conversation, please do, and we'll come to you. I'm very fascinated to hear more from you about this global, how Korea is forming its international identity, and I think that that's something that we're going to delve into. But we have one other speaker who's going to be joining us toward the end, Dhaylin Lee, who's a local here in Atlanta. She's formed the K-pop group Lunar Krew, which is engaged in performances. The K-pop World Festival has had regional competitions here in Georgia, and her group has performed. So we'll hear more from her later. To jump in with Dr. Kim here, can you just give us a quick primer? I mean, I know that K-pop, can encompass many things. So how do you view, to start the definition? I mean, where do we even begin when it comes to K-pop, and how reaching is this categorization, and how do you see it?
Yes, so I guess one of the most amusing ways to address your question might be, what does that K stand in K-pop? And obviously it's a Korean pop music standing for Korea as a nation behind the forces that make this industry possible. But at the same time, it's also a way to think about K-pop as a multimedia performance. So I define K in K-pop as kaleidoscopic pop, meaning that it's just assemblage of all kinds of visual entertainment, media contents, and global circulations around them. I also see it as a kind of keyboard pop, keyboard or keypad, in a sense that its natural habitat is really the digital sphere, particularly YouTube. So there are many different ways to articulate K-pop, but for me personally, it is really creating a new type of cultural movement for millennial generation and younger people like Generation Z, who have known digital culture as their primary sources of exchanging ideas and information, and also existing in this world. So I personally define it as kind of teenage idol music, mostly targeting hip hop, disco and dance music, and primarily catering to teenage and young consumers in their 20s. Although the fandom of K-pop could be quite broad, beyond our imagination.
Yeah, I've noticed that. You have people that embrace it from all walks of life, for sure, and all racial and ethnic backgrounds. And of course, you couldn't get to these astronomical numbers on these social media platforms and video platforms without a broad base of fandom. So tell us a bit about how K-pop walks that line between this sort of Koreanness and also incorporating these global influences. I mean, and what it means about Korea's kind of aspirations for its kind of soft power, I guess, in the world. I would assume that this melding of styles comes from a need for Korean culture to want to kind of integrate and belong to the world, but also and try to expand its global influence. But where do you think that fits in, and how do you think those influences are incorporated strategically?
So at this point, K-pop has many decades of history under its belt. So I think it really went from phase to phase. So in the very early phase of K-pop idols kind of introduction, I'm talking about late 1990s to probably first, half of the first decade in our new millennium. Back then, people were really not really thinking about making it into a Korean kind of culture. I mean, actually, they were trying to aim for something different, which is to kind of erase this culturally specific traits of pop music, and as some scholars say, make it orderless in terms of its particular ethnic traits, and potentially make it successful in music markets such as Japan. So in a way, they were really trying for this kind of more generally defined successful pop music model. But as it became bigger and bigger with the rise of digital platforms, then it really started to shift in terms of how Korean industry viewed Korea's place in global music industry. So I think one of the interesting recent trends that we find is that we see more manifestations of Koreanness in K-pop idols' fashion statement, music videos, and musical choices. So I think we're talking about a very different trend than where we started with the K-pop history in mid-1990s. And I think one of the things that K-pop really celebrates is hybridity. in all forms and ideas. So it's treading this really kind of fascinating in-between space between the global standards of popular music that is broadly defined by likes of Taylor Swift, Justin Bieber, and whatnot, and this very particular niche of manifesting themselves as Koreans and therefore stepping in as a very attractive alternative to this Hollywood and Billboard driven global culture that looks very monolithic and
Right.
very much alike. So K-pop is a very resilient industry that deals with these different, often seemingly conflicting forces quite well. And I think it wasn't really the industry's intention to be the flag carrier of Korean,
Right.
but it happened that way since it became so big with the global spread, with the digital platforms being introduced in our daily lives. So nowadays, many corporations and of course, Korean government is tapping into the power of K-pop as a way to increase its soft power to the point that in 2011, presidential committee was set to really tap into these major cultural forces such as K-pop to enhance Korea's image in the outside world.
Yeah, I was curious about that. Like, how much intentionality was behind it? Was it driven by the Ministry of Culture and Information at the outset, or did it just happen to spread like wildfire because it emerged at the same time as these new modes of mass communication, as they were undergoing this sea change really in the early 2000s? I mean, so was it intentionally pushed and then went beyond the wildest dreams of the government, or was it just an industry that really had to adapt to a globalized environment and push that way? I've even heard some people characterize it as a reaction to the Asian financial crisis of 1990s, that there was a need to boost the cultural economy, if you will, for new modes of growth. So I wondered if you can trace it and how it began to spread.
Sure. Yes, I think, Trevor, you're right that there's this inherent connection between the rise of K-pop industry and the 1998 financial crisis that spread across Asia. However, I think it's more at the level of this ideology behind cultivation of the self. Because prior to the financial meltdown of 1998, I mean, there was a sense of collectivism and sense of lifetime employment. So say that if you enter a group of big corporations, pretty much your job was guaranteed until you retired. But that kind of system that kind of supported South Korean economy and society just really went through drastic disintegration with the meltdown. So the sentiment of promoting an individual, self-advancement, that sentiment that sprung after the financial crisis very much fed into the K-pop industry. That when you see these idols' success story, it's all framed through their hard work, despite all these challenging circumstances that they had to face. So I think the connection is more at that level. But I think K-pop's kind of breaking into the global stage really, I think, happened not because somebody up there really had a grand plan to realize it from day one, but it just happened because the global media industry was changing, and K-pop as a major export item somehow merged with this grand global trend of living our daily lives with YouTube, Twitter, Google Hangout, and so on and so forth. So in a way, the industry was really optimally adaptable to this digital consumption of music. And because K-pop industry really requires massive scale of investment in grooming its idols even before they debut, they really had to look beyond the Korean domestic music market. Korean music industry scale is not that big. If you put it in the global context, it only occupies about 6% of the global music industry in terms of its size. But in terms of profitability of music sales, it's ranked at 6. So it's an incredibly efficient and profitable business model that really targets overseas kind of music consumers. And this was
Yeah.
made possible because Korean music was being introduced very easily, quickly through platforms such as YouTube.
hmm Why do you think, or I guess first of all, how did they blend the digital with the in-person? Because you mentioned cultivating the images, the idols, and all that being so important. But your recent book talks about just how important the live aspect of that is, and we can get into a little bit more about that and how that's adapted to the COVID-19 era potentially, and later in the conversation. But how important was that? I mean, and how are they able to blend those two things, the digital and the in-person, in ways that maybe amplified each?
That's a great question. Again, you have to think about the hybrid nature of Korean pop music industry. And I would say that there's a bit of a difference when you compare Korean music market and fans as opposed to the global kind of counterpart to it. In Korea, most of K-pop idols kind of activities are done through this, their appearance in music shows, generating digital contents, and that is very important. And they have to constantly do that to really keep up their fan base.
Mm.
However, if you look at, for example, U.S. Pop music market is very much dependent on live tours. So it doesn't matter who you are. You could be a megastar or somebody who's up and coming, but you have to do this town by town bus tours to really kind of accredit yourself as musician and artist. So as K-pop became bigger and became more visible in global music markets, they had to adapt this live tour model to really keep up with their status and also potentially introduce themselves to new music listeners. So this sudden kind of surge in live tour, especially overseas, really was introduced in our current decade, around 2011, I would say, with Super Junior touring 4 continents, and then groups like Big Bang doing truly, world tours, going to South America, Australia, in in the early 2010s, and of course with BTS's major success in live tours. So that's, I think, a phenomena that was introduced as K-pop idols became more and more global icons of music. And if you look at the K-pop kind of industry's income model, nowadays the table has turned around that nearly 50% of K-pop idols' income is generated by doing live tours. So I see it as a way of kind of juggling two forces that are important to K-pop musicians. But the rise of live tours can be really explained by their kind of global status and adapting to it.
Definitely. But, I'm curious as to why singing in Korean. I mean, we saw that BTS's most recent hit was an all English song, but it was their first one, right? So how was singing in Korean not a hindrance for a global audience? That to me is fascinating, because I'm sure there are a lot of other countries out there around the world that would love to have their cultural icons be translatable across the the genres and across the linguistic barriers. But is it simply that they have incorporated enough international influences to offset that, or that the beats or the cadence or the colors or the appearances are such that these visual or musical acts translate in ways that the language doesn't have to?
So I think, I mean, it still puzzles me. I mean, again, that's a very fascinating question. How did they make it so big on a global stage with Korean lyrics for the most part? And I think it's because K-pop is not just music that depends on melody, rhythm, sound, and lyrics, but it's a total performance. And this is when I think of K-pop as kaleidoscopic pop. It's foremost body performance that thrives in digital platforms, including fashion, makeup, body grooming, choreography, and the interdynamics, the relationship among band members, which is also a fascinating factor for many fans around the world. So language is just one aspect of this very complex animal that I call kaleidoscopic K-pop. So in a way, I think because K-pop really thrives in visual platforms and visual storytelling through music videos that have very high, production quality, language somehow trailed there, and they all have this English language hooks.
Yeah,
Gangnam Style has it. Every song has
right.
it. And very that was pretty much enough for fans to get into it, be hooked, and then
hmm
as they delve deeper and deeper into this universe that they newly discovered, some dedicated fans started to learn Korean or start translating into their own languages. So, for example, BTS's any content that becomes introduced immediately gets translated into 20, 30 plus languages, all by dedicated volunteer fans. So
Wow.
there are many ways to kind of circumvent this linguistic barrier. And I think the primary reason is because K-pop is not just music, but it's a total performance.
Right. Do you see, I mean, I'm assuming someone has attempted to quantify the economic impact of K-pop. Of course, you'd have to think directly in terms of the spending on concerts and albums and those kinds of things. But I'd be curious to think, to see if you thought about just the impact on the attractiveness of Korean consumer brands. You talked about or maybe the Consul General introduced the idea of K beauty and all these K dot 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 K whatevers that are out there that have become their own sort of industries. But even here in Georgia, we've got companies like Kia, who have set up a factory here and have sold their car. Hyundai in Alabama, for instance, factory. And these brands have done an extremely good job at breaking into the market and building market share. And I just wonder if there's has been any quantification of the impact of this rising Korean tide on the popularity of Korean brands around the world.
Yes, the
Obviously,
economic
Samsung, one of the top makers in the world as well.
the economic impact of K-pop on other industries have been quantified by many organizations. I think the most credible one is white paper that's produced by Korean Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism. They published this annual white paper on global impact of K-pop. I wasn't able to check the latest numbers, so I don't want to mislead any listeners.
Yeah.
However, it is true that many K-pop icons have been deployed in their commercial campaign, and also not only by these corporations, but also by city, municipal governments such as Seoul municipal government to really increase tourism to the city of Seoul. I mean, BTS has been the 3-year ambassador for Seoul tourism. So, and the KTO has published the trend of visitors coming to South Korea, and it has really doubled in the past decade. And I think a lot of its success has to be related to kind of promoting image of Korea in a more broad general sense and marrying it to most visible global pop icons such as BTS. So numbers are not my strength, so I'll stop there. But
Yeah, no
definitely there's
problem.
very visible campaign to court K-pop icons to promote
Yes.
national and municipal government's image.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you about that too with regard to COVID-19. I mean, obviously the impact of the live performances has probably gone down, but I'm sure it has. And even here in Atlanta, we've had a BTS concert that had to be postponed to the chagrin of many people, I'm sure, who were, probably 10,000 people that wanted to attend. But can you talk about, I'm curious as to whether, K-pop has been deployed in service of the, public health aims of Korea, in light of the fact that Korea was, the second country where there was a major outbreak of COVID-19, but yet was able to clamp down on it very quickly. And of course, there are myriad reasons for that. I mean, the use of technology and the very strong Ministry of Health and the early testing and all that. We don't have to get into all that, but I'm curious, was there any use of these pop culture icons to maybe bring some useful public health information to the public?
Yes, one example that I'm aware of is that there's a nonprofit organization called Sports Doctors in South Korea, and they have invited some K-pop artists such as NCT to really circulate this hashtag "Stay safe, stay home" type of message. And there was a whole chain of other K-pop idols who were involved in that campaign. So because they exert enormous influence on especially younger population, I think it's a natural thing to see in times like this, with celebrities with social influence being participants, visible participants of COVID-related campaigns.
Yeah. Do you
However,
see? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Going back to your earlier question, yes, I mean, just like everyone else, K-pop industry is hurting, in part because its kind of business model has shifted towards live tours, especially for big bands. But because K-pop's natural habitat is online space, it has weathered the storm better than other comparable industries. So because fans are and followers are so used to consuming K-pop in online space, some of their virtual concerts held by groups like NCT or BTS have done very well. And also another factor is that physical album sales is stronger than ever. And nowadays, nobody really buys CDs to listen to music, but it's a collectible item. It's a part of K-pop merchandise. But major bands have released their albums, and most of them have sold over 1 million copies. So it has a kind of system to weather COVID pretty well.
Yeah. What do you think will be the enduring shifts after this? I mean, obviously, the idea is to get back to live events where we can have 10,000 people in one place, right? But and I even saw in Taiwan, which has kind of conquered the pandemic, really. There were one of the first major public events was a concert where thousands of people were gathered together. And just wondering, do you think it will revert back to that 50%, or do you think that there will be a kind of lasting shift to even more digital or to these more innovative products like the collectible CDs and things like that?
So in the immediate future, I think there will be revenge concerts. Everybody's pent up. They all want to go out, see other people doing the same thing as they do. So I think there will be surge of live concerts. But I think this kind of new format of creating digital concerts also opened up possibilities, because I mean, they are able to do more things that are impossible to achieve in live concerts, such as having fans chat with their idols real time, or incorporating fan reaction more closely to idols' performance and having this real-time interaction. So new forms of liveness will emerge in this new platform. So I think those will be simultaneous trajectories that we'll see.
Yeah, and I think your book was prescient in a way, talking about the idea of live, right? I mean, what is live now? Live means something somewhat different in today's COVID age, because we're having these, again, hybridized versions of live and online at the same time. So I want to bring in Dr. Wang Medina as well here as we continue along. I'm very interested in this idea of K-pop being, representing, almost inadvertently coming to represent Korean culture in the global space. You've written, I think, about the tension of between culture being somewhat promoted or regulated by the government, and not regulated but promoted in the global environment as a way to kind of expand Korea's influence. Yet there could be a tension with some other creators who don't see this as authentic Korean culture. So how has that tension played out over the last few decades? Do you think it's as clear as we've been talking about, that this is representative of Korean culture, or is there kind of a subversive movement back home to say, no, this is not quite exactly what we want to present to the world?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. I'd backtrack a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
To this, the South Korean idea of soft power, and the kind of movements that Dr. Kim rightly pointed out in 2011, in 2009, there was a presidential branding commission, and that was a stated attempt to say that they wanted the South Korean brand to go from something like 37th on this register of national brand awareness to like 17th. They wanted to go up some number of brand awareness points, right?
Yeah.
And that in itself was also part of a long trajectory of exporting Korean culture. And there was a shift towards funding the cultural content industries in the mid 90s, following even before the financial crisis. Starting in around 1994, there was a push towards putting money into cultural content, creative industries, like something like, I don't know, characters, cartoons, as well.
Yeah, animation has been huge.
Right, yeah, as well as gaming, as well as like film and popular music. The thing that happened there, I think that was very fortuitous, was that it happened to be at a time when the market, as Dr. Kim was saying, was ready to move on to this new kind of phase. And they were able to capitalize on this in a way that also was a time when attention was shifting away from from Japanese popular culture, maybe. Korea became a viable alternative for Japanese popular culture content, which had historically been more expensive. So I would think, like, too, I would say, thinking about the landscape that K-pop really kind of ushers in is part of a bigger media landscape that includes film and includes television. K-drama is also a vehicle for K-pop, right? As well as K-beauty and all sorts of things. When you have beautiful Korean people running around driving nice Korean cars and like using, you know, there's a whole visual kind of habitus, that like lifestyle that can be promoted in all these different ways.
Yeah, definitely. And that reminds me of, there's a question in the chat here about you know, whether this is a fad or something that's sustainable, and the idea from Michael Park here, who says, this reminds me of the rise in popularity of Japanese food and culture in the 80s and 90s. So I think the question there is, how sustainable is this? Does it continually have to innovate to stay relevant in the global space? And if you want to address that, you can, but very quickly, I wanted to remind people that if you want to type your questions in, you can do that now into the chat function to me or to everyone, and we'll get to those toward the end. But you know, I'm curious if you can trace, you know, this kind of push from the government side back even further. Is there any sense in which this is trying to contrast, you know, South Korea with North in a way to show, you know, openness, capitalism, global integration? Is there any residual effect from that in this kind of new generation, or is that an outdated way to even look at it? And it's just mainly an economic push.
Are you asking me this?
Yeah. I'm curious about, you know, was the push from the government side, was it purely economic? Was it purely a way to, you know, kind of generate growth from another sector, or was there a more fundamental, you know, identity aspect of it that sought to contrast South Korea with North Korea potentially?
I think there's certainly it's not just economic. Otherwise, they wouldn't be putting money into things like literature, which makes no money. But the Korean government has done wonderful support for Korean literature and translation, and you can see it changing. You can go to a major bookstore and find Korean titles in translation. You can see year-end best of lists and things like that. It's not just because they put money into it, but it's because there's been more interest, and there have been new translators and new people who are kind of reviving some idea of Korean culture. They're redefining it, right? They have been for the new millennium. And while there is an economic incentive behind this, a very strong one, I think there is also a real desire on the part of the Korean government, as well as Korean people, to have their culture recognized as both a culture with a long history and a long aesthetic history, as well as you know, the contemporary, like, high-tech Korea that we see.
Yeah. What do you think are the fundamental roots of that? You know, because there are a lot of countries around the world that want to see their culture promoted, but maybe have not gone to the links that the Korean government has. Like, why is this so fundamental to this outreach, I guess, to have a globalized Korea?
Well, there's
I'm sure that's a big question, but
a question. This is actually the topic of my book. So,
yeah.
my book when it comes out. There's certainly historical resonances for, you know, a comparison to Japan. The term K-pop itself is kind of an extension of J-pop, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were no letter pops for international popular music before J-pop. Like we don't call French rap F rap like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So there is this comparative aspect that always gets brought up, even in the literature. The question that I always got in the early 2000s was, who is going to be the Korean Murakami? And I would say no one, because Murakami is a Japanese author. There will be a Korean author, you know, be representative of Korean literature. At the same time, there is this question of kind of defining Korean culture for the global audience that is in opposition to, you know, the other Korea, right? And I think this is aided too. We shouldn't forget that this is really aided by the Korean diaspora, which is fairly large and is in kind of not strategic, but in cultural centers around the world, which does provide a kind of landing platform for Korean culture to come in. This is, I think, was particularly important for Korean food.
Yeah, and I think that's still playing out in places like Atlanta, which has a, you know, newer Korean community, although pretty sizable now. I think, you know, depending on the estimates that you hear, it's up to 100,000. You know, and it also depends on how you define Korean, right? Is it Korean heritage? Is it Korean American? Is it, you know, Korean citizens who are living here as expats? Like, how do you actually drill down? But I think the you know, the sort of Korean background population that's here, whether that be first, second, or third generation, is somewhere around 100,000. And I'm curious too, like, you know, I read a recent Bloomberg article about, you know, the way that K-pop fans online have activated in terms of, or in support of causes like Black Lives Matter. And I wondered if you might give us some color on that, and just like give us a sense for, like, why do you think these fans have gone to such great lengths to, say, hijack hashtags that were you know, used to support conspiracy theories and things like that? Why are they so internationally active, and why are they so identified? Like BTS's fans call themselves the army, right? Why are they so passionate and connected, and, you know, wanting to export that passion to other places where, you know, they may not even be familiar with the issues?
I'm sure Dr. Kim can speak to this better.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from both of y'all on that if you want.
But I would say that there's a real, we need to make a distinction between local Korean fandom and international and global K-pop fandom, because I wouldn't say that K-pop fandom in Korea is quite as political as it has appeared to be recently in the US. They're certainly mobilized, and they have strong communities, and that's something from K-pop fandom that has been kind of translated out. And they have historically mobilized to donate to charities and do kind of philanthropy, but not necessarily quite as political. I would, in the United States context, what I've been seeing really is a kind of self-identification with this. Within the army or within different K-pop groups, that they are community building, and the K-pop groups are really responding to this activism, right? So BTS's contribution to BLM came after the hashtag standing, right? The K-pop stands, and I think this has. I would connect this kind of to community building within musical subcultures, which has been going on for a long time in pop music. Yeah, but I'd like to hear Dr. Kim's thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I would too, if she wants to address that.
Yes, so this is fascinating, and I agree with Dr. Medina on all her points, but also just to elaborate a little more, I think also if you look at least US fans of K-pop, there is a fairly large representation of racial minorities, sexual minorities, who are naturally keen on issues such as Black Lives Matter movement. So what we saw this past summer is a kind of collapse of those two forces coming together. So I think we should also kind of look into who is actually following K-pop music in this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's maybe a fascinating topic for another webinar for sure, because we're running up on the time where we need to integrate Dhaylin Lee into the conversation. But as a segue into that, I wanted to ask y'all, Atlanta calls itself a capital of hip hop, and I think is pretty indisputably now a hub for the film industry, much like LA, also is Hollywood, right? And also home to a thriving hip hop scene, and I would assume a pretty large Korean community. So I wondered if there are any lessons here in how a city can relate to the world or can reach out to new and diverse communities, or take advantage of those communities that are here in terms of economic benefit, right? We have, like we said before, they're concerts that are going to be welcoming 10,000 people. Those are going to be having a huge economic impact on our metro area. And there seems to be a push even, from the consulate, as well as from just the broader community of melding these musical and film styles together in new ways that maybe we haven't even seen before. So I wondered if y'all wanted to comment on whether there were lessons for ways for cities to capitalize on this wave, or even work with their diaspora communities in a closer way. And either one of y'all are welcome to take that. Go ahead.
I'm the one that's in Atlanta, I guess.
Yeah.
I would say I was really happy to see that you had invited Dhaylin. I'm sorry, I forgot her name, but
Dhaylin, yeah,
the K-pop dance crew community, because I think it's important to publicize these people, the local people who are engaging with Korean culture in kind of new and in innovative ways. I was looking at some of their videos, and they're doing these K-pop dances kind of all over the city of Atlanta, and this is a kind of a great kind of dual function that they're having.
Mm-hmm.
They're very multicultural. It looks like they're great dancers. It was very nice to see. I would also add for the maybe Korean business community, I'm not sure if everyone is aware, but Atlanta is like a hair center of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the big global wig and hair companies are based in and around Atlanta, which is one of the reasons that the Korean community has grown there, because that industry is dominated by South Korea. And so there are, I went to a wig convention last year where they were showing this hair that's mostly used by African-American women. And they were modeling it on African-American women who were there, who were doing dances, and they had this side by side with kind of traditional Korean dances and like a mishmash of food. And it was really fascinating. So there are already these kinds of integrations happening, but I think to bring it to a socio-political level and bring awareness to the fact that this is happening would be very helpful.
Yeah, I think so too. And I feel like there's not enough intentional cross-pollination between the hip hop and the K-pop communities in Atlanta. I think there's a lot more fertile ground to be plowed here with that. But I wanted to bring in Dhaylin. I don't know, Dhaylin, if you want to turn on your video and chat with us for a moment. I think you founded the group Lunar Krew, and just tell us a little bit about it and how you got involved in K-pop and what it means to you.
Okay. So I first founded the group in my high school years. I was a freshman, sophomore at the time. I connected with other K-pop fans. Before, there wasn't really much exposure of K-pop around Atlanta around the time when I made this group. So it was more how to find other K-pop fans.
Mm-hmm.
So
where did your love of K-pop originate? Like, how did you first encounter it? And is it related to family history or your culture at all, or was it just something you discovered?
It's definitely something I discovered. I've always been a very minded person. I'm always interested in learning about new cultures, and because of YouTube, I came across K-pop music and drama, and it was just like it was something very new to me. But I was really interested in learning about it. So that's how I got introduced to Korean pop culture.
So you used your crew as a methodology for finding other K-pop aficionados around Atlanta. Is that right? Like
Yes.
you used your dances and stuff like that to find other fans. Tell me about participating in the competition. What was that like? What does a K-pop competition look like, and what skills do you have to exhibit when you're doing that?
Well, we, my group, we entered the World Festival last year. Um, sorry.
Okay.
We always wanted to have an opportunity to, because we've seen previous competition that happened, and there's videos on YouTube. Other dancers and singers, they compete and then they get sent to Korea to perform in front of a live audience. So we always wanted that experience. So that's why the team entered the competition.
And you're judged on what? The strength of your choreography, or what is it that determines the decision for the winners?
One of the criteria is definitely like the song plays and the choreography does it, and also the audience reaction. If we get a good reaction, if we get a lot of cheers, yes, and creativity. And
Yeah.
I think our team, we worked really hard to put on a good performance. We definitely wanted to show that we really love Korean pop choreography, and we wanted to show that in our performance.
Yeah, for sure. Who's your favorite group, and what was your? I think y'all came in second, right, in the
Yes.
regionals. So you were very, very close to getting to go to Korea.
Yes.
So sorry about that. I feel your pain a little bit. I was supposed to go to Korea this year, and then of course with the pandemic had that canceled. But who's your favorite group, I guess, and what was your favorite part about performing?
Some of my favorite groups, I really like the older groups. Like I do love BTS, but like I also love Sistar. I love Big Bang back then. I just a lot of groups. Like I'm very open with music. As
And the performance aspect, is it the dancing that you like so much? Because you're not so much singing, are you? Or are you're sort of lip syncing mostly in the performances, right?
yes,
Yeah.
for performing, we it just feels like we are actually performing these songs. Like we see these
Mm-hmm.
on stage and giving them their all, and
Yeah.
so we wanted to try and mimic that just because we want to feel how it feels to be on stage, being performed.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, are there other things that this translates into? Like, does this give you more confidence? Like, I would assume any kind of performance where you have to get up in front of people and present a work that you've created, a dance that you've created, or anything like that is going to build your confidence. But do you feel that there are other, team building or other aspects of this that really help you in your broader life?
Yes, actually, the being into like getting into the culture, getting into K-pop, it as personally for me, am more confident. I do, especially with my group, like I had built a connection with strangers at first, but now we are really close and we
Mm-hmm.
come together and we build these projects together. We go around and perform in Atlanta. We do these things together. So it
Yeah.
definitely has impact us as a team, and like
Mm-hmm.
like we yeah.
Yeah, you bond over it. That's really cool.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. And we haven't even talked about the idea of how this plays into the study of Korean language around the world, because I'm sure we can trace back some of the Korean programs at our universities here in town, not only to the security aspects of dealing with the Korean Peninsula, but also to these cultural aspects that as K-pop and other media have grown in popularity, we've had more people just interested in general. We had one question in the chat, and if we've got 5 minutes left, so if anybody else has questions, please do chat them at me in the chat function. But someone, Paul Pass, has asked, what has been the public reception to BTS's delay of military service? Maybe Dr. Kim, if you want to talk about that. I think there's compulsory military service in Korea, right? At least for men, I think. And so tell us about what reaction there's been to that, if you know.
Right, as many of you know, Koreans have such intense emotional investment in military service, right? It's such a defining moment in male citizens' lives. So I've seen mixed reviews. I mean, I think the tension is really there. The younger generation, especially followers of K-pop and especially BTS, tend to really justify why they should be exempt. If the pianist Jo Sung-jin, who won Chopin International Concours, is exempt, why is not BTS, who had landed on many top charts around the world? The impact is even bigger. So I hear a very strong voice, but also equally overwhelming voice is that it's a sacred duty to our nation. They should, of course, serve it as the kind of representative face of Korea and its cultural forces. So, yeah, the debate is still going on, and I think the forces are equally strong. If I may, I'd like to address this other question by Michael Park,
Sure.
because it's an important question, and the question is, is this a fad? How long will it last? I mean, especially in comparison to Japanese cultural boom in the 80s and 90s. And I think more pressing kind of comparison could be made to the cultural boom of Hong Kong pop music and cinema of the 80s and 90s. Having grown up as a teenager during that time when Hong Kong cinema was huge and its movie stars were my idols, I've seen its rapid decline. And from the day one of my research in K-pop, I've been asking the same question. So I'm very glad to address it here. I've gone through many skeptical moments, but having seen the kind of evolution of K-pop over many generations, I can say that it's likely to stay here longer than we might anticipate. Of course, in the world of pop culture, nothing is permanent. And even the term Hallyu or Korean wave is a stream that flows and cannot be contained. So it will eventually phase out, but not anytime soon. And I say so because based on the global comparable music industries, K-pop is perhaps the only industry that really systematically produce music for younger listeners at its kind of massive scale. I think another comparable kind of industry is J-pop, but they're not really targeting global audience as K-pop is trying to do. So in that sense, we can claim that it's the only pop music industry that really systematically produces music for young listeners and performance for young consumers at its kind of massive scale.
Yeah, so maybe, ride the crest of the wave a little bit longer. Dr. Medina, you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I completely agree with Dr. Kim. And I would add too that the interest in Japanese culture in the 80s and 90s, I mean, it starts kind of further back in the post-war era when there is a need to turn Japan from enemy into friend, right? Because there's a necessity to have a bulwark in East Asia. But what happens with that, with the popularity of Japanese popular culture, manga, food and film and things like that, it became part of the kind of international canon of, artistic, whatever, right? Artistic culture. And I think this will be kind of the lasting effect of the Korean wave, that once it's established, then it's there, it's in there. So Korean fine art, Korean cuisine, all of these things will become part of, I think that's the kind of end goal, I would say, of this kind of soft power push.
Yeah, and I wanted to know if you wanted to address the language issue as well, since you're involved in translations and things like that, and you are in this department within Emory that has Korean language under its purview. I wondered if you could talk to the growing interest in Korean language, and is that going to be sustained, and what does that look like at this moment? And then we'll close it out.
Well, it's still growing. I think the only two languages that are growing for in universities are Korean and ASL, American Sign Language.
Wow.
Interesting. I think as long as it continues to be popular, there will be a rise in this. And I have so many students who come in because of K-pop, and recently now because of other things too, like they love mukbang. So they're Korean and they want to learn Korean, or and this is also related to how fast it gets translated by the fans. So like I think really embracing the fandoms that exist is very, very important for Korean culture, because they're doing a lot of the outreach that just gets done for free. It's
yeah, definitely.
It's important, right?
And I would assume there's some interesting linguistic lessons in the translations as well, just like figuring out how do you translate a certain song and what does it mean to translate it for a global audience, English speakers in this kind of global versus regional dialects and things like that. So I wanted to thank you all so much. Thank you to all our participants for joining us. We will publish this online with the permission of our speakers, and also I think Global Atlanta will be doing a summary article that will embed that in there as well. And so we'll keep the discussion going. But I wanted to thank the Consulate General of Korea here in Atlanta for approaching us about this and for working with us on it and allowing us to work with them on it, really. And our speakers, Dr. Wang Medina, Dr. Sukyung Kim, and Consul General Young-jun Kim, as well as Dhaylin Lee. Thank you so much for your perspective. That was really helpful and helping us understand the appeal of K-pop. So again, thank y'all. And I really had a good time talking with y'all about this important topic, and hopefully we can connect in person in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. 김 교수님 수고하셨습니다.
감사합니다.
메디나.
네, 감사합니다. 네.
Bye.